Well, happy Father's Day. Isaiah this morning reminds us of what it is to be a prophet, which is a complicated vocation to be sure. Isaiah reminds us, on the one hand, that the business of the prophet is to call people to account, to have them look in the mirror and look long and hard. And yet also, fundamentally, the vocation of the prophet is to provide hope, is to provide a vision of what life can look like when justice is restored, when our right relationships are reestablished, and when we turn around and make new choices. Well, about 10 years before I became a father myself, I got a window into fatherhood that got me thinking about the kind of dad I hoped that I would be when the time came. Many of the dads here will probably agree with me that the most important training we get in that department is from our own fathers. Certainly the case with me. But I don't think I had yet given that much thought in particular until one day. It was spring, and the JV baseball team at the school where I was teaching was having a lackluster season again. But the catcher of the team was in my C Block English 10 class, and he'd been trying to get me to come all season, and I felt guilty for not having gotten there. And so on this particular May afternoon, there I was, with a handful of other parents, out to see the game, and an away game, no less. It was a lovely spring afternoon in Wilmington, Delaware, with the trees in full flower and the sky impossibly blue. A lovely afternoon. Or should I say it was a lovely afternoon until the bottom of the fourth, when one of the parents from the other team started loudly complaining about the officiating. Now, I have to say, speaking for myself, I don't particularly notice that kind of thing right away. I mean, I am from Brooklyn. People from Brooklyn talk back. Most of the games I have been to involve seats so far away from the field that you're actually worried about nosebleeds. And in seats like that, you can say whatever you want. It's kind of part of the fun. But this circumstance was different. We were all right there. And so it wasn't long before everyone in our little group was uncomfortably aware of the man in the Titleist visor loudly complaining. And it really was not fun. "Come on, ump!" he burst out loudly at one point when the umpire called a strike. Then when that batter went down a few pitches later, he said, "Oh, for crying out loud!" You know that look you sometimes give each other, the one that says, "What on earth is going on here?" Well, there were a lot of those looks pinging back and forth through our little section of the bleachers during that inning. Well, then it got worse with the next batter. In another couple of pitches, he said, "This guy's an idiot." Well, at that point, one of the moms on our side intervened. "Whoa, sir," she said, looking over disapprovingly. But to no avail. It turns out, of course, this was just the prelude. It was at the bottom of the next inning when guess whose son came back up to bat. "All right, PJ. All right, here we go, PJ. Here we go." Well, poor PJ whiffed the first pitch. The man stood up in the bleachers. Come on, son. Do it. he said. The next pitch came. PJ swung like he was going to hit that ball straight to New Jersey, whiffing again. Strike two. Come on, son, get it together. Well, at that point, the other coach turned around over on his bench. Our parents were just about ready to call DCFS at that point. But the game continued. Thanks to a decent pop and fumbling from our shortstop, who tripped, which was sort of how he played, PJ actually made it to first base. And the man in the bleachers celebrated with, by then, characteristically poor form. I wondered for a moment if anyone over there was so lame as to actually let him share a high five. But the answer appeared to be no, which was, in its own way, reassuring. As happens, though, in baseball, the dad's joy was short-lived, because on the very next pitch, the batter knocked the ball back toward our shortstop, and this time our shortstop didn't trip. He scooped up the ball and tossed it over to second just in time, and PJ was tagged out. You know those moments when everything just sort of seems to slow down? Well, this was one of those, because I could see that the dad was leaping off of the bleachers and running onto the field and starting to shout at the umpire like Billy Martin in the TV of my childhood. And I saw his son's coach leap up and try to drag him off the field. But it's the next moment that is the one I really want to remember. Because it was then that I saw our coach, like Atticus Finch in the trial scene of To Kill a Mockingbird, slowly, calmly, collectedly get up from the team bench and walk over to the home plate umpire with a weary smile. He waited a moment, stood just to the side. The face of the man, the umpire, and the other coach were all various shades of red and purple, and you couldn't make out most of the words except for some. Our coach just stood there, and then after a moment he said, "Excuse me, sir," to the umpire. The umpire turned and he said, "Coach," because this was way escalating. There our coach was, and he just said, "Sir, I think we'll take our run now." And he smiled, and he went back and sat down and picked up his clipboard. And it was as if all of a sudden something else managed to kick in. It's like when you're trying to jumpstart a car and suddenly the sputtering engine revs in the way it's supposed to. Because the umpire stood back and then he nodded. Then he turned and faced the bleachers and he pointed to our bench and he said, "Scorer! Score 1 home run, Sanford School." And he turned to the man and he said, "Sir, you're ejected from this game. Get off my field. Now." And after another moment, with his son's coach taking him by the arm, off the man went to sit out the rest of the game in his car. You see, I don't know what the rule is here, but in Wilmington, Delaware, when a parent charges onto the field, it is an automatic home run for the other team. But I hope what you'll see is that in that moment, it really wasn't about a home run or about winning a baseball game. It was about quietly making sure that something else, after all these innings, finally kicked back in. That's what made it a moment of moral grandeur. It was a moment when somebody finally stood up to say, enough. It's a reminder in an unimportant game, during an undistinguished season, that fair play matters. Fair play always matters. And character always matters. And that, in fact, whatever the game may be, those are the things that actually really matter. And out of nowhere, as I saw this scene unfold, for the very first time, I had the thought, when I'm a dad, I want to be like that guy. Of course, as we know, not all fathers out there do. As we know all too well, PJ's dad isn't the only one who didn't seem to get the memo of that's what fatherhood is all about. And the children of those great Santini types often end up having the baggage to show for it. Also, it will probably not surprise you to learn that for many people, their relationship with God begins as a kind of extension of the relationship that they had with their parents, and in particular, the relationship that they had with their fathers. So many of the people who decide to reject faith altogether and who speak of God as angry, judgmental, and supremely to be feared are remembering the flaws of human fathers they've known. I find it hard to blame them. Imagine, for example, what PJ's understanding of God must have looked like at that time in his life. But the instinct of Scripture is to try to describe God not as angry or not as simply and entirely a remote and stern lawgiver. The instinct of Scripture is actually not to imagine fatherhood or God our Father as the guy who just shouts at us from the stands. If you read the Bible attentively, what you find is a God who is more typically like the father in the parable of the prodigal son, a God who worries sick about us when we're off doing our own thing, but who nevertheless gives us the space to do our own thing. The God of the Bible is much more like the God in our reading from Isaiah this morning, a God who calls and calls for us, who reaches out to us, who wants good things for us, who gets exasperated with us, who winces in those moments when, for whatever reason, it seems as if we can't get out of our own way. But God never stops loving us. God never stops loving us. There are a lot of people who would be astonished to learn that God's fatherhood isn't really about control or about pushing perfection. God is more about dusting us off when we fall and also sitting us back on the bicycle. God's concern is about teaching us to try and to keep on trying. God knows that we aren't perfect now and that we never will be, but that's not meant to be cause for punishment or for shame. If you read the Garden of Eden story or the Tower of Babel story or the Noah story or the David story, I think you'll conclude that God must have made his peace with the imperfections of humanity a long time ago. And as the church, we affirm that God's definitive response to all that imperfection is the gospel story. God responds to us at our worst by loving us anyway and working even harder to show us the way to the life he promises us in him. God works to bring something good out of the worst and darkest things that we humans go through, no matter what it takes. No matter how high the price, no matter how dark the hour, no matter what is before us, no matter how painful the life is we are going through, it is God who comes forward and says to the storm, "Be still." It is God who comes forward and says to injustice, "Enough." That's the kind of father he is. That's the kind of God that people need to hear about. Especially, I think, in these days when we are remembering Charleston, still mourning Orlando, and watching the news in the meanest political season that anyone can remember. We need to tell people about the love of the Father, which does not condemn us or anyone, but forever reorients us, believes in us, and counts on us. God knows that despite our imperfections and our undeniable shortcomings, each of us can still be a force for good, a voice of reason, a source of kindness. God's delight is to see what it is we do with his gifts. That is God's understanding of what it is to be a father. On Father's Day, may we be especially grateful for all the men in our lives who heard God's call and sought to go and do likewise.